Well, and welcome to the Lighthouse Sessions. Today, I'm really excited. I have my new friend Arshavir Blackwell with me, and I want to thank Emmanuel Rose for thinking enough of me to say, you got to meet this guy. He is super cool. So, Arshavir, welcome to the show. Tell us
Thank
a
you.
little bit about who you are and what you do.
Sure. Well, I've been doing AI for a while, longer than it's been cool. I have to say, I first started on this journey back in the 90s at UC San Diego, which was a very big hotbed of neural network theory, which is what we call the current AI back then. And I was very fortunate to work with two leaders in the field. One was Elizabeth Bates, who was a linguist who brought a lot of her theories of actually human language development into the neural network space. And the other was Jeff Ellman, who was the inventor of the Ellman network, which is one of the first neural networks to actually handle language way, way, way back in the day. And one of the really interesting things about Jeff's work is he predicted essentially this whole idea of using the next word to predict in the training of the network. So the way that current networks work and the way that his network also worked was it was trained to predict what the next word should be and then scored on how well it predicted whether or not it was actually correct or not. And that's basically the training that current transformers also get. So I had a great time with them. I was really lucky to work with them. I then worked with a series of mostly startups, some companies that were a little bit bigger, some companies that started as startups and then ended up getting acquired or becoming bigger. I worked for a name you may remember from way back in the day, Ask Jeeves. I was working on their question answering system and trying to get it to be more automated because it was hand done at the time. And what I'm working on now is basically mechanistic interpretability and as well as we discussed earlier, voice. So mechanistic interpretability, what I find absolutely fascinating is that nobody really, even at the companies that make these transformers, these LLMs, nobody really understands how they work except in a very general sense. So we understand the basic architecture, of course, because we've created them. But when you type in a long array of text and it seems to respond to you in a very intelligent fashion, the exact way that that works and the way that it can change its style depending upon the kinds of information that you provide it, all of those things are really not very well understood at all. And that all goes under the heading of mechanistic interpretability. So it's going into the layer. The network, of course, is a series of layers and layers and layers and layers of weights. And so the procedure of mechanistic interpretability is basically going into and analyzing what each of those layers of weights are doing and trying to, from that, pull out more generalizations. The part about voice is I've come across in the consumer and the marketing area a lot of people who they're very challenged by the fact that they put stuff in to the LLM and it always has the same, essentially the same voice. It's very hard to get it to change its voice. So you can put in, a request for a write-up on something, and then if someone puts in a request for a write-up on the same topic, they're going to sound almost identical. And that's kind of a tell. Now, of course, you can go in and rewrite it yourself, but the problem with that is then, what was the point of going through the LLM in the first place? So those are kind of my two big focuses right now, and they're related because part of voice is looking at the inside of the LLM. But that's where I'm at today.
I love it. So first of all, I want to say thank you for your service with Ask Jeeves. I literally the other day, I said, I really miss Jeeves. I wonder what happened to him. So
it was folded into IAC and it's still around in a sort of post, death posthumous form as ask.com.
Okay. There we go. Well, I love Jeeves. I remember, back in the day, it was magic. It was like,
Yeah,
seriously, first early humans discovering fire, going, ooh.
it was very cool. And, I'll tell you, it really, a lot of that tinkering was done by hand. So when you typed in those um, questions, the questions had already been pre-processed and were thrown back at you in real time by the computer. But the weights, this is the part that I worked on, the weights for those questions were hand designed. And that was the part that I said, look, you guys, there's algorithms out there that will do this automatically, and you don't need to be doing this by hand. And
Yeah.
we had some pretty good, results. And then, of course, the dot-com crash killed everybody's, expectations of everything. So, but if it hadn't been for that, it would have been pretty cool.
That is awesome. Well, let's talk about voice, because
Sure.
I'm fascinated, and for what it's worth, I try to train my LinkedIn algorithms to not bring me nonsense, but it loves to bring me the I call them the AI haters. They're the ones who go, "Oh, this is the sure tell of an AI model," and
Right.
um, I think the personally, I'll just let you know a little bit about my personality. When people started complaining about the M dash, I put one on my little clipboard, and whenever I could, I'd put one in somewhere.
Yeah.
Just um,
I had the same problem because I have always, even in high school, loved the M dash. I think it's great. It does a lot. It's better than a comma for a lot of things. And when I first started seeing people say, oh, the M dash is a tell that something is AI, I got extremely irritated by that because I felt it meant I was, forced to change my personal writing style from years just because some people were saying that it was an AI tell.
yeah. Well, and I think that's the key. One of the things. So we're going to talk about voice because, from my perspective, I've written many books, and I've used AI as a collaborator. I've also written many. I can actually write a book by hand still if I have to. I try not to because it hurts my hand after a while. But
Yeah.
um, one of the things I'm fascinated by is the voice, and I'll give you an example. Um, I have used the word alchemy for a very long time. I love King Arthur's court and the legends of Merlin, and the work of Leonardo da Vinci. And so a lot of my work has the word alchemy in it. And then I've noticed that AI seems to be, I'm seeing it a lot in AI created content. I'm like, do I change my word, or do I just accept that that's out there?
Right.
So let's talk about what voice is to people, because I think a lot of people don't see the difference or don't fully understand. If it's not clearly AI generated slop, we lose track of what is our voice. So what
Yeah.
led you to that path? Because I feel like that's a fascinating story in itself.
Well, I was actually a dual major in college, and my other major was creative writing. So I've always been interested in writing, which kind of is what led me partially into LLMs because they're, automated systems for writing. Um, what I have found, I've been doing some experiments with just this sort of question of how do you find a metric to measure the voice or the various dimensions of a voice of a particular document. And I've come up with some and this is preliminary, I'm still working on it, but there's some interesting kind of findings here. One is you can use stylometrics, which is just basically a whole suite of non-LLM style uh, measures. So, number of punctuation marks of a certain kind, burstiness of sentences. Do you always have sentences of the same length, or do you have, short ones followed by long ones followed by short ones? Word choice, obviously, grade level. All of those can be used to combine to kind of make a portrait of the style of a particular piece of writing. Now, there are other ways to also measure the style of a particular piece of writing. And one thing that's very interesting is I've found it an interesting problem to look at the difference between LLM that's basically putting on a voice as a costume. So it really is just changing a few small things here and there in order to sound more like a particular voice that you're training at with. And a LLM that is actually changing the way that it is processing that information at every layer. And as an example of this, what I did was I trained an LLM on I have a small local language model, and I trained that using an adapter, which basically is you're training the base layer and then you're giving it in additional training information on top of that. And that influences the output. And you can then look at what's happening at every layer. Say there's like 33 layers or 34 layers in this particular network. You can look at what's happening and you can say, where in these layers are the changes occurring? Are they occurring just at the output layer? So if you see changes happening just at like the very top layers, that's what we would call a costume. So it's just basically changing a few words here and there. There's nothing major being changed. And if you look at the stylometry of it, there's probably not a huge variation between that and the base that you've been using before the training. If you get a really different style from the base style that you're training from, then what you get is you can see that in the deeper, middle, and even early layers, there's really big differences in the ways that it's processing the information. So instead of being the same, and then different, it's different all the way. And the reason that's significant is because if you're trying to kind of make a new voice, you want to make sure that your system is going to be consistent and safe and have guardrails so that it always kind of sounds the way you expect it to sound. So, for example, you can only test it on a certain limited range of sample utterances. And so if you get an utterance that's not in your data set, you may get something that doesn't really sound the way you're hoping for it to sound. I've done some experiments with this. Basically, if you just ask the LLM to say, do a Southwestern style or do a very educated style, very often what comes out is it is very much like a costume. It sounds very much like it just added a few words here and there, a few changes in word choice to make it sound like, hey, howdy partner, how's it going? Like a guy wearing a cowboy hat and standing next to a cardboard cactus. If you actually change the inner layers and are successful in doing that, you get what comes out as a much more authentic, style, whatever that is, Southwestern style, educated style, so on and so forth. So it's that tension or noise between what we get on the surface final output and what's going on inside that's very interesting to me. And the other reason this is important is because very often when people are testing their models, they're just looking at the outputs. So they'll do their run of, making a series of training steps to have the system learn their voice. And then they'll just have some sample sentences that they'll run through it. And they'll say, oh, well, looks like it's producing the correct result. So we're done. Yeah. But if you look inside the system, you see that something different may actually be going on.
Well, and you mentioned 33 or 34 layers.
Yeah.
I have a feeling if there's a little drift in each one, we end up way off course by the end. Is that fair?
That's exactly what happens. So what I've seen are basically two cases. One case is where there's no drift essentially until the end, and then you get relatively small but still measurable changes in the output. And the other is where at each stage it slowly gets, more and more distant from where it would have been if you were just using the base model. And what's interesting is that these changes you can actually subtract out and find directions in that high dimensional space, the geometry of the space. So for example, I was training it on a whole bunch of different, essentially Victorian era authors. So people like, Mark Twain, Dickens, so on and so forth. What's interesting is that when you compared the direction of all of those as a group in the LLM's space in which it was thinking, so to speak, that direction was very, very distinct from, for example, just generic text from the internet or a Substack post or something like that. So there actually was like a Victorian literature direction in the information. Now, is it literally Victorian literature? No, there's certain aspects of Victorian literature, the way the sentences are put together, the language they use, and so on and so forth, that all tend to be very high markers of this kind of literature. So it's not, literally speaking, Victorian literature. It's all of these different kinds of these different writers who all are from the same era and have a commonality of style.
I love that. And I'm sure one thing that you probably saw a lot was that the M dash is much older than the advent of ChatGPT, because I believe Shakespeare used it.
Sure. What's funny is I know that there was actually, I've read somewhere where there was a one of those chat, detectors to tell you whether or not what you're listening to has been, or what you're reading has been written by AI. Someone put the Constitution of the United States in there, and it came out as being generated by ChatGPT. So, that's, for what it's worth, that's how good those systems are, in my opinion.
So spoiler alert, I believe most of those systems are a scam in and of themselves, because one of the things I find, I'm neurodiverse, and I believe our brains work a lot like large language models. I can write to trigger a AI 100% positive, or I can write to trigger a very low AI score. Just depends on the mood I'm in and what I want to do. So it's funny, but my take on all of this is, rather than worrying about, I'll throw in the odd M dash just to mess with people. I'll throw in a not this but that, because I know it triggers people.
Yeah, I do that too.
But I think one of the things we're going to talk about the authentic voice, because I think what I see a lot is, it's not so much is it AI generated, but is it good or bad writing? Period.
Yes.
And
absolutely.
If your ideas are clear, I don't care how you created it. I mean, believe it or not, there was a time when people looked down on you if you used an actual ballpoint pen instead of a quill.
I don't doubt it. Or a typewriter, right?
Yeah. God forbid. Oh my God, you used a machine to type it up. I don't care. Good writing is good writing. I mean, the reality is, if you're a bad writer, AI is just going to make you bad and loudly bad, and it just gives you more opportunity. So how are you helping people? Now, I know you've got your own version on a Mac. I'm training my own version on a PC. Technically, it's Ubuntu, but it's also a PC-based machine. Between you and me, I've been using Project Gutenberg to train it.
Oh, really? Interesting.
Yeah. So just for you, you're a fellow nerd, I'll share this. Project Gutenberg has open source licensing on all kinds of classics. I think it's before 1950, give or take. But you can download various types of data from them. And so my favorite is, I download an HTML and then I convert it to markdown files. And so I've actually picked some of my favorite Renaissance period books. I've gone as far back as Sun Tzu and The Art of War. And, I think his translation that I'm using was translated in 1910. But I'm using the pure language that existed before there was any suggestion that maybe AI was a thing. And I am finding, I've built a couple of them that are based on certain, I have one based on Eastern philosophy. I have one based on the ancient Roman philosophy. I have one based on the Renaissance period. It's amazing to see the different linguistic styles. And The,
Absolutely.
the, the beautiful thing has been the continuity of ideas over time. The
Mm.
best ideas have survived generations, cultures, cultural collapses.
Right.
It is fascinating to see the old wisdom that we still chase today. So let's talk about your model. What is the plan for the model? What are you using it for now, and where do you see it going in the near term?
Well, so the model, as I said, it's a local large language model. And that means that instead of sending your information out to some frontier model like ChatGPT or Claude, it stays all on your machine. So the reason that this is a good thing, why it's an advantage, is a lot of the people that I talk to in marketing and things like that don't like the idea of their intellectual property going out to the over the internet to some, unknown person or parties that's doing who knows what with it.
Yeah.
What is it being used for? Is it being used for training? Is your information going to show up somewhere else? So the first advantage of it is you are basically air gapped. Your system doesn't even have to be attached to the internet in order for you to get this thing to work. The second advantage is you don't have to pay for tokens. And as we know, tokens are getting expensive. And I'm reading a lot of these articles now of like these huge bills for tokens that a lot of companies are coming up with. And of course, if you have a large language model that's running just on your own machine, you're not going to have to pay any of that.
Yeah.
So the application that I've been working on is basically designed with a couple purposes in mind, but the main purpose is to take your voice. So what it would use as inputs would be, let's say, blog posts, promotional material, anything like that. And it learns using these adapters that I was talking about before. It learns that particular voice without having to go out to the internet and send any of that, training data out. So after it's learned that voice, you can type in, let's say, write me an ad for, a new Southwestern special meal that we have. And whatever your voice is that you've trained it on, it will provide you with text that really sounds like the voice that you've trained it on. And the way that people are doing this now, which doesn't, as I alluded to before, doesn't work as well, is to put that in the prompt. So, here's the style that I want, do it in this style. And that's where you get that costume effect that I was talking about before, where it sounds like the style that you're kind of going for on the surface, but once you sort of break it down, it comes off as very inauthentic. And if you think about it, that kind of makes sense, because when you're describing a style and when you're giving samples of a style, those are two very different things. So you kind of have in your mind what this style is. And so, you come up with a few adjectives to describe it. But that's not going to be as dense or as rich of a description as actual samples of your work.
Yeah.
So you give this sort of parallel training system actual samples of your work, and it's able to learn off of this much richer set of inputs and then output it to, the way I have it designed now, it can format it so that it's a LinkedIn post and that has a particular style. Facebook post, there's a couple others, along those lines. I think we have Instagram. It's called yourvoicecraft.ai, by the way. And so, and it's in alpha right now. So the upshot is it gives you back your voice, but allows you to still use AI.
I love that. And I think a lot of people, what they don't realize is how bland
Yes,
pure AI content is. And
right.
earlier you talked about the 34 layers. One of the things I find a lot is I'm dealing with when I use ChatGPT or Gemini or Claude, I've got their biases baked in
Exactly.
at the top. And anything I give them at the top of the conversation saying, here's my voice, the longer that conversation goes, the more we drift. We talked about that
Yeah,
drift.
that drift problem.
At the end of the day, their hard-coded guardrails will outperform in terms of weighting my instructions. And
Exactly. Your
I
system prompt gets washed out.
and I don't think they even know the math, but my experience, I'm going to guess directionally, it's 90% of the guardrail gets washed. It'll stay throughout, and
Yeah.
about 10% of what I share, it washes out, and it becomes lesser and lesser over time.
Yeah. I think, I've certainly had this experience, and I think a lot of people have, of where it gets it right to a first approximation. And you're actually, was a friend of mine was just talking to me about this very thing, because he was like, oh, this is so exciting. I did, 5 hours of work in 4 minutes. And then he called me later and he said, I take it all back, because what happened was it did the first 90% exactly the way he wanted it, but he could not get it to do that last 10%. And the last 10% was not particularly challenging or difficult or weird. It was just that it was a little bit more out of distribution probably than what he was trying to get it to do previously. So in terms of these tools being useful, they're only as useful as they allow you to fully complete your task. If in the end it takes you more time, even if the first part of it only took 4 minutes, then you're really not going to be excited about using this tool anymore. And I've had that experience a lot too when I was doing coding, is that I would say, okay, this looks great, but there's this one change and it's not quite working, so can you fix this? And we would just iterate endlessly, and it would it would spin its wheels. And I would assume that this is a problem that's being worked on by frontier model companies. And I would assume that it's a problem that, it's going to go away eventually. But for now, it's something that we all have to deal with one way or another.
I love that. And for what it's worth, I'm going back to an old Tony Robbins workshop or presentation where he talks about the modern airline. Let's say we have a flight leaving New York that's destined to land in LA. They're off course 95% of the time.
Yeah.
And it's the pilot's job to keep bringing the plane back to course correction.
Right.
I think that's the key. Is if you're like, for me, I'm always interjecting and correcting things, so I can land almost precisely with most things. But if you're not course correcting from the minute you leave New York, you might land in Honolulu and go, oops, or God forbid, you end up in Vancouver and you're like, wow, we really missed the mark.
Yeah, exactly. And, to that point, that's one reason I think the local large language model has a lot of advantages. And I think that in the next couple of years, you're going to see it becoming more and more popular, not just because of the cost differential, but because you can do a much more precise job of steering it than you can with a frontier model. So all of the experiments that I've done have been, of course, with local language models, because you can't do experiments with frontier models because their weights are all sort of sealed away. And, I'm assuming that Anthropic or OpenAI can do their own experiments. But if you're not within, their garden, then all you have is large language models that are resident on your system. And people say, oh, but it's, just running on your local computer. How powerful can it can be? But I say, well, look, it depends on what you're using it for. I mean, you don't need a aircraft carrier to go, fishing, right? And if you're doing something with marketing, if you're doing something with summarizing, something like that, a frontier model is probably not going to give you a huge advantage, and it is probably going to cost you a lot more money.
Yeah. Well, and one thing I would say, and I would love your take on this, I don't know anything about the secret ingredients in any of the big models. I mean,
Right.
there is, the weights are one thing, then there's the training data. So for me, when I train a local model, I know exactly what went in there because I'm the
Right.
one who added them.
Right.
And,
Right.
and I think, it's funny because, I sometimes accidentally design databases when I'm trying to build models, but it's the purity of the data that matters so much.
Yeah. Well, I don't, I'm not privy to what's going on over at OpenAI or any of those places, obviously, but I will say that there is something in addition to the traditional training regimen. So traditionally, what you do is you have a whole bunch of text, as I said, and then you present it to the network. And whether it's a local model or a frontier model, it's basically trained to predict what is the next word.
Yeah.
There's something else that involves human feedback, and that's called reinforcement learning. And that's a slightly different kind of result and a slightly different kind of algorithm. What that involves essentially is getting humans to rate how good the
Yeah.
responses are, and then using that information to feed back to the training mechanism. And it's a different kind of learning algorithm and so on and so forth. And it has, a lot of clear advantages. One of the problems, though, is sycophancy. So everyone, kind of knows that one of the big issues with LLMs is they always tell you you're right. Whoa, that's a great idea. It's a multi-million-dollar idea. Oh my God, you're going to be rich. And
You're brilliant.
yeah, wow, that is so smart. I mean, yeah, you're a brilliant individual. And it's believed that part of the reason for that behavior is because of this reinforcement learning, because the system is basically being trained to tell you what you want to hear. And clearly, what you want to hear is going to be something pretty positive. Um, so I think that as far as the frontier companies go, that's about as far deep into what they're doing that, one can really peer without reading a lot of papers and kind of trying to intuit what's going on. But yeah, I think reinforcement learning is probably is certainly a key issue in all of this, questions of LLMs and sycophancy and how are all of these working. But whether or not in the end it's going to end up being a big part of the training, I think is still unclear.
I'm having a flashback to my early days. In a past life, I was an accountant and I was in the tax field. And this applies to any professional field, any mentorship apprentice program. But basically, we would be given templates as students, and our job was to go do research and to create the actual letter, whatever it was, the report, whatever it was. And then we would get feedback from a partner or a senior person. Not always nice feedback. It was usually fairly blunt and had some direct improvements to it. But if you think about it, that's how we all, as professionals, we mastered our own voice.
Yeah.
And it's funny because in hindsight, that was almost like the early days of a language model, because every letter we produced would get added to a database. And when you had that same issue, you'd go look at these series of letters. And it's funny because early I did tax law research. It was all based on court precedents and things like that. Like literally, if you think about it, our modern legal system is very much similar to how LLMs are being built today.
Yeah.
There's precedents now. Unfortunately, it's a black box. We can't see, 4 out of 9 Supreme Court justices voted against this. Therefore, there's some risk to it.
Right.
But I'm fascinated because as a human society, we've been building these data points for decades, long before, as you said, AI became cool.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm curious. I think now I want to pick your brain because I live at the bleeding edge of technology, and I feel like you're somehow way further out there. So this is where it gets fun, Arshavir. I can ask you questions, and then I can quote you to other people, and they'll think I'm predicting the future. So,
Okay, let's do it.
what are you nerding out about today that's got you super excited about the future of voice and models?
Well, I think there are a lot of things. I think that one of the things is what we've already covered, and I think is a big thing, which is local large language models, I think, are going to be a much bigger part of the scene. And I think it's because, again, of the fact that it's cheaper and you can be air gapped and you can have a lot more tuning of the system and do a lot more tweaking of the knobs, and you have a lot more control of the knobs uh, than you would with a frontier model. So that's one big thing. I think that the integration of large language models into the workflow is just beginning. So everybody sees these enormous valuations that these companies are getting. But I think we're just at the very beginning of the hockey stick. And what you're going to see in the next 5 or 10 years is going to be how artificial intelligence essentially drives almost all areas of commerce and intellectual discourse and inquiry, just as much as the internet has come to do that today. I think another thing, though, is we have to remember that these models right now, believe it or not, for all their complexity, are extremely primitive. And that surprises a lot of people when I say that. But the fact of the matter is that there's some aspects of their architecture that are more primitive than I would say the ones that Jeff Allman worked on, not in terms of, the number of neurons and the scope, but in terms of other aspects of architecture that probably more closely reflect what the human brain does. And we're not seeing any of that in current language models at all. I mean, what I find, one of those statistics that I find just incredibly crazy is when you look at the energy usage of a single LLM to do a single query, and you have these huge data centers sucking down power, and then you see that the human brain does all of that and more on a few kilowatts, about what you would use to power a light bulb. And well, not even kilowatts, just watts.
Yeah.
And it's just incredible. And what you have to ask yourself is, what is all that extra power being used for, and what are we doing wrong? Because we are doing something wrong if we need all that extra power to do something that's very incredible, but still not as good as what the brain does. And I think that's an area where you're going to see, I hope, some real pressure and some real development in the future. Another area, I think, is that these are really just kind of like a brain in a vast vat. And so they don't have any sort of embodiment. They're not interacting with an environment. They're not able to, interrogate what's going on around them. And I think when these systems become entwined and merged with humanoid robots, or any kind of robot, not even humanoid, you're going to see the learning pattern for them is going to be amazingly different, because it's going to have actual real world correlates and not just words that it's learning on. And the last thing is, I've thought for a long time that the data center issue could be at least somewhat, the problems with it could be lessened somewhat if we put data centers in space. And just now, the past 6 months or so, suddenly that's become a hot topic. And, the obvious power issues, if you have, solar, then you're good to go. And then there's no heat issues because it just radiates off into space. So I think, especially with the SpaceX, IPO being so amazingly successful, and the fact that they just bought a $60 billion AI company, I think you may see that as being a more frequent, more common use case for space in the near term. So those are my small set of my predictions that, feel free to give those to whomever you want if you think they're of any value.
I love it. The good news on that is I probably got about a 2-year runway with those ideas before people catch up to it.
Yeah.
I'm going to give you a weird little gift from my world. So first of all, I'm obsessed with size. I actually managed to build my own language model on a USB key.
Really?
Minor detail. Yep. Totally forgot about heat dissipation. I burnt my hand on the damn thing because they're not meant to be
right, doing that kind of thing.
I was like, what is that smell? And I'm like, oops. So I also built one using a Raspberry Pi.
Uh-huh.
Heating and cooling. The cooling is the hard part.
Yeah.
But I'm going to send you down a rabbit hole, and I'll send you a link to this. But one of my favorite things is an old concept called Zettelkasten, which
Hmm.
is a German word for slip box, and it was actually created by a sociologist named Nicholas Luhmann. And basically, what he did was he broke ideas down into atomic. So imagine, if you can, and I mean, this was probably early language model science. He had little recipe cards or little catalog cards, and every idea had a card and a reference, and it linked all of his ideas together. He's still being published long after he passed away
Hmm.
because his ideas were so pure and well organized. I think Zettelkasten, believe it or not, is the path I'm going down. I think it's going to solve a lot of that inefficiency because
Hmm.
it's more about, the problem I see with a lot of language models is it's recalculating from scratch every time.
Yeah.
With Zettelkasten, you have sort of a proven base, and it's just bringing in the pieces. So it's
Right.
if that helps you in any way, I'm obsessed with how we store ideas. One of my other favorites is a more modern book. It's Tiago Forte. He wrote a book called Building a Second Brain.
Hmm. I
Uh,
think I've heard of that
It's
one.
it's oddly prophetic when you think about it. He wrote it before we were talking about all these things. His ideas were just, how do you journal and archive ideas? I'm now using a lot of those ideas to improve the language models I train. So nerds got to be nerds. We're going to play along. Now, I could talk to you all day, and I promise, Arshavir, this is not the last conversation you and I have, because
Okay, well,
there's
good. I hear that.
more we need to nerd out about. Where can people go to learn about you, your work, and maybe how they can use your tools to build their own or have their own air gapped LLM on
Right.
a local
Well, one
machine?
thing that I'm working on, as I said, is yourvoicecraft.ai, and they can go there and give me their email address, and when it's ready, I will, email them information about it. I also have a Substack on which I write about a lot of these issues, specifically mechanistic interpretability, and that is inside the black box.ai. And every, couple weeks or so, I find some interesting problem in mechanistic interpretability and try to do a little bit of a deep dive in exploring it. Those are the two best places.
I love it. Well, you and I are going to have more conversations
Great.
because this is a passion of mine. And how do we, I help people create their talks for the stage. I help people turn their ideas into books. Preserving the unique ideas is a passion of mine. So
Yeah. It's a problem that I think, is going to become more and more apparent with LLMs as they become more and more widely adopted. And people start saying, I found 10 different articles last week on this topic, and they all sounded exactly the same. And people are
yeah,
going to, I think, begin to get a little tired of that.
yeah. And I think that's, I saw some article where some student was busted for submitting, I think, 100 fake research papers.
Yeah.
The world is going to have to go through a reset because, first of all, what we knew to be true is been stretched.
Right.
But it's also, I want to hear the nerdy voice of the professor who came up with the idea, not the milquetoast AI version that some
Yeah.
student replicated.
Right, exactly. Although, to be fair, I've also heard of cases where students have sworn that they did not use AI and they've been accused of using AI. And I find that troubling as well because
Yeah.
I think there are students out there that are not using AI in their writing. And you feel it's like the M dash. You feel like you're kind of penalized if your writing is
Yeah.
good or if your writing is in a certain style that happens to look like what an AI does. It's going to go both ways, and it should be very interesting to see the changes that education is going to have to make in order to deal with this huge disruption in their normal workflow.
And I think that's going to be the biggest disruptor is how do we assess learning if not papers and exams? I think there's going to be a huge opportunity, but that's a whole different show just between you and I. So
okay, that sounds good.
I want to thank you, Arshavir, for hanging out with me, and it was a real pleasure.
I enjoyed it very much. Thanks a lot. We'll have to do this again.